My cold-hearted billionaire ex-husband came to my birthday party uninvited to humiliate me. He was shocked to see twins who looked just like him. "Those are my sons," Richard said, each word precise and deadly as his steel-gray eyes fixed on the 4-year-old twins. "My heirs. And you've kept them from me for 4 years." The possessive claim in his voice, the same tone he used when discussing his companies, his properties, confirmed everything I had feared. Not, "I've missed 4 years of their lives," or, "I could have known them, loved them." Just ownership, pure and simple. "They're children, Richard. Not assets. Not extensions of your empire." I found myself standing taller, protective instinct overriding the intimidation I'd once felt in his presence. "They're little boys who need love, patience, and room to become themselves. Not trophies to be displayed or molded into miniature versions of you." His jaw tightened dangerously. "You had no right to make that decision unilaterally. No right to deny me knowledge of my own children." "And what would you have done if I'd told you?" I challenged, my voice trembling with 5 years of pent-up fear and anger. "Incorporated them into your perfect life? Made them another acquisition to be managed by your staff? Scheduled them between board meetings and investor calls? Have you ever had to keep a secret to protect the people you love most? Have you ever faced the moment when that secret finally comes crashing down around you? If you've ever had to choose between truth and protection, give this video a like. I'm Mr. Harrison, and today I'm sharing the remarkable story of how a birthday party confrontation changed 3 lives forever, and how the coldest heart can sometimes find its way back to love. The invitation had been a mistake. I knew it the moment I saw Richard Carter standing in my doorway, immaculate in his bespoke charcoal suit that probably cost more than 3 months of my mortgage payments. At 38, he remained devastatingly handsome, tall and lean, with the kind of sharp features that seemed designed for magazine covers and boardroom intimidation. His dark hair was perfectly styled, not a strand out of place, and his steel-gray eyes surveyed my modest home with barely concealed disdain. "Evelyn," he said, his voice smooth and controlled. "Happy birthday." The room had gone completely silent. Even the children's cartoon playing softly in the background seemed to have paused, as if sensing the gravity of this intrusion. "Richard," I replied, proud that my voice didn't tremble. "This is unexpected." Clearly, his smile didn't reach his eyes as he extended a small, exquisitely wrapped package. "I was in town for a meeting and thought I'd drop by. For old time's sake." A blatant lie. Richard Carter was never in town, anywhere that didn't serve his precise purposes. My modest suburban street in a city 3 states away from his corporate headquarters was not a place he would casually drop by. Just hours earlier, I had been standing in my bathroom, applying my signature crimson lipstick, feeling both decades older and impossibly young at 32. I hadn't wanted a birthday party. After the divorce was finalized 5 years ago, all I had wanted was quiet, space to rebuild the life Richard had so thoroughly controlled, to rediscover the woman I'd been before becoming Mrs. Richard Carter, trophy wife and carefully curated accessory to one of the country's most ruthless tech moguls. But my sister Maggie had insisted. "You need to reclaim celebrations," she declared with the absolute certainty that had made her a successful therapist. "Show yourself and everyone else that joy doesn't belong to him." So there I was, hosting a modest gathering in the charming but decidedly middle-class home I'd purchased with the settlement I'd fought tooth and nail to secure. A far cry from the 20,000-square-foot mansion where I'd spent nearly 5 years of my life, but the first place since my marriage that felt truly mine. When I'd opened the bathroom door, I'd found both twins waiting, dressed in matching blue button-up shirts and khaki pants that I'd laid out for the special occasion. Caleb, always the more serious of the two, was attempting to smooth his brother's perpetually tousled dark hair. "You look pretty, Mommy," Caleb had said solemnly, his gray eyes, so hauntingly like Richard's, studying my emerald dress with the careful attention he gave to everything. So pretty," Jordan echoed, bouncing on his toes with barely contained energy. "Like a princess." I had knelt down, gathering both boys into my arms, breathing in their clean, little boy scent of shampoo and the faint sweetness that seemed unique to children. These precious boys, My miracle, my strength, my most closely guarded secret, had come into my life when I thought everything was falling apart. The irony still struck me sometimes. 2 weeks after the divorce was finalized, after Richard had coldly informed me that our marriage was over because he had outgrown our relationship and needed someone who could truly understand his vision, I had discovered I was pregnant. By then, Richard had already moved on with his 24-year-old executive assistant, making it clear that I was a chapter he had closed. In the shock and devastation that followed, I'd made the decision to keep this information to myself. It hadn't been spite, though many might have seen it that way. It had been self-preservation. Richard Carter collected beautiful things, companies, properties, art, and for nearly 5 years, he didn't form attachments, he acquired assets. And I had known, with bone-deep certainty, that if he'd learned about my pregnancy, the child would have become his most prized possession, and I would have been reduced to merely its caretaker, forever tethered to his control. The discovery that I was carrying twins had come later, after I had retreated to my hometown 3 states away. By then, my decision was cemented. The boys would be mine alone, free from Richard's cold perfectionism and conditional approval. I would give them what Richard never could: unconditional love, freedom to discover their own identities, and the space to be children rather than extensions of their father's ambition. Now, standing in my living room with Richard's unexpected presence filling the space like a storm cloud, all those carefully constructed protections were crumbling. "How thoughtful," I replied, not moving to accept his package. "Though I don't recall sending you an invitation." His smile tightened infinitesimally. I assumed mine was lost in the mail. After all, we did share 5 years of marriage. "For years, 10 months and 17 days. I corrected quietly, the precision a habit I couldn't shake even 5 years later. During our relationship, I had learned to arm myself with exact facts and figures. They were harder for Richard to dismiss than emotions or impressions. Something flashed in his eyes, irritation at being corrected, perhaps, or surprise that I would dare to do so. During our marriage, I had gradually stopped contradicting him about anything, finding it easier to acquiesce than to weather his cold displeasure. "May I come in?" he asked, though he was already stepping forward, the question merely a formality. I moved aside mechanically, my mind racing. Why was he here? We'd had no contact since the divorce was finalized. He'd made it abundantly clear that I was a chapter he'd closed, an acquisition that had depreciated in value and been liquidated accordingly. "Lovely home," he remarked, his tone making it clear it was anything but by his standards. "Quaint." Maggie stepped forward, her protective instincts visibly engaged. "Richard, what an unexpected surprise. We're just having a small family gathering, as you can see." "Maggie!" His acknowledgement was glacial. He had never forgiven her for being the one person in my life he couldn't charm or intimidate. "Still offering unsolicited opinions, I see. Still manipulating situations to assert control, I see," she countered smoothly. The tension in the room thickened. My other guests shifted uncomfortably, witnesses to a power dynamic they couldn't fully comprehend. This was exactly what Richard wanted, to disrupt my carefully constructed new life, to remind me that he could invade my space at will, that my boundaries meant nothing to a man who had built an empire by crushing obstacles. "Perhaps we should speak privately," Richard suggested, his tone making it clear this wasn't a request. In our marriage, I would have immediately acquiesced, desperate to avoid his cold displeasure. But that woman, the one who had gradually surrendered her voice, her preferences, her very identity to keep the peace, no longer existed. "No," I said simply. "Whatever you have to say can be said here. These are my friends and family." Something dangerous flashed in his eyes, the brief, unguarded reaction that had always preceded his most devastating takedowns in the boardroom. I had seen that look directed at business rivals, at subordinates who disappointed him, but never so nakedly at me. During our marriage, his control over me had been exercised with more subtlety. A raised eyebrow at an inappropriate comment, a gentle but firm redirection of my misguided opinions. "Very well." He straightened, his 6'2" frame somehow expanding to dominate my modest living room. I've been reviewing some of the terms of our settlement, and my lawyers have identified certain discrepancies that need to be addressed. They'll be contacting your attorney tomorrow. The calculated cruelty of using my birthday party to deliver this threat made my chest tighten. The settlement had been my one victory, modest by his standards but enough to provide security for me and the twins. The settlement was finalized 5 years ago, I replied, fighting to keep my voice steady. Approved by the court. Circumstances change. His smile was razor-thin. New information comes to light. Before I could respond, a high-pitched voice called from the hallway, "Mommy, Caleb won't share the red truck." The color drained from my face as Jordan came barreling into the living room. His dark hair tousled and his gray eyes, Richard's eyes, bright with indignation. He skidded to a stop when he saw the room full of silent adults, his 4-year-old social radar immediately sensing the tension. "Jordan," I said, my voice unnaturally high, "why don't you go back to the playroom? I'll be there in a minute to help with the trucks." But Jordan, always the more impulsive of the twins, was already studying Richard with undisguised curiosity. "Who are you?" he asked bluntly, in the direct manner of children. Richard's gaze had fixed on the child with an intensity that made my heart pound against my ribs. I watched as his analytical mind, the same mind that had built a tech empire through ruthless pattern recognition, processed what he was seeing. A 4-year-old boy with his exact coloring, his distinctive gray eyes, the same sharp jawline visible even in childish features. "I'm an old friend of your mother's," Richard replied, his voice oddly strained. His eyes never left Jordan's face, cataloging every feature with growing comprehension. "Mommy, Caleb says I have to give the truck back, but I had it first," Jordan continued, momentarily distracted from the stranger by the pressing injustice of sibling toy disputes. "Caleb," Richard repeated the single word loaded with dangerous inquiry. As if summoned by his name, Caleb appeared in the doorway, the disputed red truck clutched in his small hand. Unlike his brother, he immediately assessed the room's atmosphere and froze, his serious gray eyes, even more strikingly similar to Richard's than Jordan's, widening as they fixed on the tall stranger. The silence that fell was absolute. I could hear my own heartbeat thundering in my ears as Richard looked from one boy to the other, his brilliant mind calculating dates, timelines, possibilities. "Twins," he said finally, the word falling like a stone into still water. His gaze swung to me, cold fury building behind his perfect composure. 4 years old, I presume? I couldn't speak, couldn't move. This moment, the one I had feared since the day I discovered my pregnancy, was unfolding in the worst possible way, in front of an audience with no preparation, no legal protection in place. "Boys," Maggie stepped in smoothly, moving to the twins with forced cheerfulness. "Who wants to help me bring out the birthday cake? I think it's almost time for Mommy to make a wish." Caleb, sensitive to adult undercurrents, looked uncertainly at me. "Mommy, are you okay?" "I'm fine, sweetheart," I managed, finding my voice at last. "Go with Aunt Maggie. I'll be right there." As Maggie ushered the reluctant boys toward the kitchen, Richard's controlled facade cracked, revealing the cold rage beneath. "You were pregnant when we divorced," he stated, his voice dangerously quiet. "You concealed my children from me." "I didn't know I was pregnant when we divorced," I replied, the truth giving me strength. "I found out 2 weeks after the divorce was finalized." "And you didn't think to mention this rather significant development?" His sarcasm cut like a blade. "You made it abundantly clear our marriage was over," I said, fighting to keep my voice steady. "You had already moved on with Vanessa. The papers were signed. The settlement was complete." And that's when he said those words that confirmed my worst fears. "Those are my sons, my heirs, and you've kept them from me for 4 years. If you've ever had to make an impossible choice to protect someone you love, hit that like button." The confrontation between Evelyn and Richard was just the beginning of a journey neither of them expected. One that would challenge everything they thought they knew about each other, about love, and about the true meaning of family. After Richard left with his ominous promise that tomorrow will be different, The party continued in a strained fashion. My friends tried their best to restore the celebratory mood, but the shadow of Richard's visit hung over everything. I went through the motions, opening gifts, blowing out candles, laughing at the right moments, while my mind raced with fear and contingency plans. When the last guest had departed and the twins were tucked into bed, I sat alone at my kitchen table, the small package from Richard still unopened before me. Part of me wanted to throw it away unopened, to deny him even this small connection. But curiosity, and the strategic awareness that I needed to understand his mindset, won out. Carefully unwrapping the elegant paper, I found a small velvet box. Inside was a delicate platinum necklace with a single perfect emerald pendant, exactly matching the dress I was wearing today. The coincidence was unsettling until I remembered that emerald green had always been my favorite color, though Richard had discouraged me from wearing it during our marriage, claiming it didn't suit my complexion. Beneath the necklace was a small card with Richard's precise handwriting. To new beginnings. Some things are worth revisiting. The message sent a chill through me. Was he suggesting what it seemed? That after 5 years, after the way he had discarded me, after discovering I had hidden his children from him, he was somehow interested in rekindling our relationship? The Richard Carter I knew didn't forgive betrayal. He certainly didn't respond to it with expensive jewelry and cryptic messages about new beginnings. He responded with ruthless, calculated destruction of whoever had crossed him. So what game was he playing? The sound of my phone ringing startled me from my thoughts. Checking the screen, I saw an unknown number. With a sense of inevitability, I answered. "Hello, Evelyn." Richard's voice was calm, controlled, as if our confrontation had never happened. "I trust the party concluded successfully. What do you want, Richard?" I was too tired for games. "I want to propose a civilized approach to our situation," he replied smoothly. "Rather than immediately involving lawyers, perhaps we could meet tomorrow to discuss arrangements for the boys." "Arrangements," I repeated, wariness creeping into my voice. "Yes, visitation schedules, educational plans, that sort of thing. Practical matters." The reasonableness of his tone made me more suspicious, not less. Richard Carter didn't do reasonable when he felt wronged. He did scorched earth. "Why would I agree to that?" I asked carefully. "You threatened legal action less than 3 hours ago." "I've had time to reflect," he replied, and I could almost see him adjusting his cufflinks, a habit he had when crafting a particularly careful response. "Litigation would be messy, public, and ultimately damaging to the boys. I prefer a more elegant solution." "Which would be?" "We meet. We discuss. We find a path forward that acknowledges both my rights as their father and your concerns about my parenting style." The pause before concerns spoke volumes about what he really thought of my objections. "And if we can't agree?" I pressed. "Then we proceed to less amicable options," Richard replied, his tone still pleasant but with steel underneath. "But I think we can be adults about this, don't you? For the sake of Caleb and Jordan." The casual use of my son's names he had learned only hours ago, sent a surge of protective anger through me. But I forced myself to think strategically. Meeting with Richard would give me a chance to gauge his true intentions, perhaps even find leverage to protect the boys from his controlling influence. "Fine," I said finally. "Tomorrow, noon. There's a cafe called Bluebird on Main Street. Public, but quiet enough for a private conversation." "I know it," Richard replied, and of course he did. He would have researched everything about my life here the moment he decided to make an appearance. Noon it is. After hanging up, I sat motionless, staring at the emerald necklace glinting in the low kitchen light. Richard's sudden reasonableness was more alarming than his anger had been. It meant he was planning something calculated and precise. The question was, what? Morning came too quickly. After a restless night, I rose early, checking on the twins who were still sleeping peacefully, blissfully unaware that their world was about to change forever. I stood in their doorway, watching their small chests rise and fall, Caleb neat even in sleep, Jordan sprawled across his bed with limbs akimbo. How would I explain Richard to them? How could I introduce the concept of a father they had never known, never missed, never needed until now? By the time I arrived at the Bluebird Cafe, I had rehearsed a dozen different approaches to the conversation ahead. I had dressed carefully, professional but not formal, a navy blue dress that projected confidence without the defiance of yesterday's emerald green. My hair was pulled back in a simple knot, my makeup minimal. Nothing Richard could criticize or use to dismiss me as emotional or irrational. He was already there, of course. Richard Carter was never late, viewing punctuality as a power move rather than a courtesy. He sat at a corner table, a cup of black coffee before him, scrolling through something on his phone with the focused intensity he brought to everything. As I approached, he looked up, his gray eyes, so like Caleb's, assessing me with clinical precision. Evelyn, right on time. Richard. I took the seat across from him, declining his offer of coffee with a small shake of my head. Let's not waste time with pleasantries. What exactly are you proposing? A flicker of something, amusement, respect, crossed his face at my directness. Very well. I propose a co-parenting arrangement that acknowledges both my rights as their father and your role as their primary caregiver. Specifically, I pressed, unwilling to accept vague terms that Richard could later reinterpret to his advantage. I want regular visitation, weekends to start, perhaps expanding to longer periods during school breaks. I want input on their education, healthcare, and other major decisions. I want them to know who I am, what my family legacy means, and what their place in it will be. The possessive note in his voice when he spoke of family legacy confirmed my worst fears. This wasn't about forming a relationship with two little boys. It was about securing heirs for the Carter empire. And what about what they want? I challenged. What about their needs as 4-year-old children who have never known you? Children adapt quickly, Richard replied dismissively. And I'm prepared to make the transition as smooth as possible. Private tutors, child psychologists, whatever resources are needed. Of course, his solution involved throwing money at the problem. That had always been Richard's approach to emotional complexity. Apply sufficient resources until the inconvenient feelings were managed away. The boys have a stable life, I said carefully. Friends, routines, a sense of security. I won't allow you to disrupt that for your own agenda. My agenda is to be a father to my sons, Richard countered, a hint of genuine emotion breaking through his controlled facade. Sons I didn't know existed until yesterday because of your choices. Yes, my choices, I acknowledged, meeting his gaze steadily. Choices I made because I knew exactly what kind of father you would be, the same kind of husband you were, controlling, perfectionistic, viewing them as extensions of yourself rather than individuals with their own needs and desires. Richard's jaw tightened, but he didn't deny the characterization. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, his voice lowering. People change, Evelyn. 5 years is a long time. Not that long, I replied skeptically. Not long enough to fundamentally alter who you are. And who am I, in your expert assessment? There was a dangerous edge to his question. A man who collects beautiful things and discards them when they no longer serve your purpose or meet your standards, I said simply. A man who views relationships as transactions and people as assets or liabilities. A man who always puts his own interests first. For a moment, genuine anger flashed in Richard's eyes. Not the cold, calculated fury I had seen yesterday, but something hotter, more personal. Then it was gone, replaced by his usual mask of control. Your opinion of me is noted, he said coolly. However, it doesn't change the legal reality. I am their father. I have rights, and I intend to exercise them, with or without your cooperation. Then why this meeting? I challenged. Why not go straight to your lawyers as you threatened yesterday? Richard studied me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Because contrary to your characterization, I do consider the boys' well-being. A protracted legal battle would be disruptive. How considerate? I couldn't keep the sarcasm from my voice. And it has nothing to do with the potential publicity. Billionaire CEO discovers secret twin heirs isn't the kind of headline Nexus Technology shareholders would appreciate, is it? A muscle twitched in Richard's jaw. A tell I remembered from our marriage. A sign that I had hit a nerve. My concern is for Caleb and Jordan, not public perception. Then prove it, I challenged. If this is truly about forming a relationship with the boys rather than asserting your rights or securing your legacy, then agree to a gradual introduction. No overnight visits, no disruption to their routines, no grand announcements about their status as Carter heirs. Just get to know them as people first. Richard considered this, his analytical mind visibly working through the proposal. And in return? In return, I won't fight your right to be in their lives, I said, the words difficult to speak but necessary. I'll help them understand who you are, prepare them for each visit, support their relationship with you as long as it remains healthy for them. For several long moments, Richard was silent, weighing my offer against whatever strategy he had originally planned. Finally, he nodded once, decisively. Acceptable with conditions. I want regular visits twice weekly to start, for a few hours each time. I want to be introduced as their father within 1 month, not as mommy's friend indefinitely. And I want your commitment that you won't leave the state or otherwise attempt to limit my access to them. The terms were more reasonable than I had expected, which immediately made me suspicious. Richard Carter didn't compromise unless he saw a clear advantage in doing so. I can agree to those terms, I said carefully, with one addition of my own. The boys' well-being comes first. If at any point they show signs of distress or negative impact from these visits, we reassess immediately. Define distress, Richard countered immediately, ever the negotiator. Children have tantrums, bad days. Normal developmental phases can't be used as excuses to restrict my time with them. I'm talking about persistent changes in behavior, sleep disturbances, regression in developmental milestones. I clarified. I'm a good mother, Richard. I know the difference between a bad day and a child in genuine distress. After another calculating pause, Richard nodded. Agreed. We'll start tomorrow. 3 o'clock. I'll come to your house. Fine, I said, already mentally preparing for how I would explain this to the twins. But remember, you're just a friend of mine for now. Nothing more. For now, Richard agreed, a hint of something almost like anticipation in his voice. Though I think you'll find the boys might be more receptive to the truth than you expect. As we stood to leave, Richard reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a small envelope. Their birth certificates, he said, placing it on the table between us. I'd like copies. I stared at him, momentarily thrown by the request. How did you? I have resources, Evelyn. I know their full names, their birth date, their pediatrician, their preschool. His expression was impassive. I've spent the last 24 hours learning everything I can about my sons. Of course he had. Richard Carter never entered any situation without complete intelligence. It was what made him such a formidable businessman and such a terrifying adversary. I'll have copies made, I said stiffly, taking the envelope. Anything else? Just one thing. For the first time, something almost like uncertainty crossed his face. What do they know about me? About why I haven't been in their lives? The question caught me off guard with its hint of vulnerability. They don't know about you specifically, I admitted. When they've asked about their father, I've told them that some families have a mommy and daddy, and some just have a mommy or just a daddy. That their family is me and Aunt Maggie and Uncle Leo, and that's perfect just the way it is. Richard's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. So you've taught them they don't need a father. I've taught them that families come in different forms, I corrected, and that they are loved completely, exactly as they are. For a moment, something that might have been regret flickered across Richard's face. Then it was gone, replaced by his usual mask of control. Tomorrow at 3 then. As I watched him walk away, his tall figure commanding attention even in the casual setting of the cafe, a strange mixture of emotions churned within me. Fear for what his presence would mean for the twins' peaceful existence. Anger at the disruption to the life I had so carefully built. But also, unexpectedly, a faint echo of the attraction that had once drawn me to him. The sheer force of his personality, the intensity of his focus, the way he moved through the world as if it had been designed specifically for him. I pushed that last feeling away firmly. Whatever Richard and I had once shared was long dead, killed by his controlling nature and my eventual rebellion against it. Now we were just two people connected by children, nothing more, nothing less. If you've ever had to negotiate with someone who once held all the power in your relationship, hit that like button. The journey of Evelyn and Richard was just beginning, and neither of them could have predicted how their carefully constructed agreement would change not just their children's lives, but their own hearts as well. The next day, I spent hours preparing the twins for Richard's visit. I explained that an old friend of mine wanted to meet them, someone I had known before they were born. Jordan, predictably, was excited at the prospect of a visitor, while Caleb regarded the news with his usual thoughtful caution. "Is he nice?" Caleb asked, his gray eyes, so like Richard's, serious and assessing. I hesitated, searching for words that were honest but appropriate. "He can be," I said finally. "He's very smart and very successful, but he doesn't spend much time with children, so you'll need to be patient with him." "Does he like dinosaurs?" Jordan wanted to know, already planning how to impress our visitor. "I'm not sure," I admitted. "You'll have to ask him." At precisely 3 o'clock, the doorbell rang. Richard Carter's punctuality was one of the few traits I had always appreciated about him. I opened the door to find him standing there in what passed for casual attire in his world. Tailored charcoal slacks and a light blue button-down shirt. No tie, sleeves rolled up to reveal strong forearms. He looked less like a corporate titan and more like a man, and the distinction was unsettling. "Evelyn." He greeted me with a nod. His expression controlled but with an undercurrent of tension I rarely saw in him. "May I come in?" I stepped aside, noting the wrapped packages tucked under his arm. "The boys are in the living room," I said. "I've told them you're an old friend who wanted to meet them." Richard nodded, his jaw tight. "And how much do they know about our history?" "Nothing beyond that," I assured him. As we agreed. As we entered the living room, both twins looked up from their play. Jordan immediately bounced to his feet, curiosity overcoming any shyness, while Caleb remained seated, studying Richard with careful intensity. "Boys," I said, keeping my voice light and natural. "This is my friend, Mr. Carter. He wanted to meet you both." "Hello," Richard said, and I was startled to hear a slight roughness in his usually smooth voice. "It's very nice to meet you, Caleb." "Jordan." "How do you know which one is which?" Jordan asked immediately, always direct. "Most people get us confused." A faint smile touched Richard's lips. "Your mother told me that Caleb is the serious one, and Jordan is the energetic one. Plus, Jordan, you have a small freckle just beside your left eye that your brother doesn't have." I blinked in surprise. I hadn't mentioned that distinguishing mark to Richard, and it was subtle enough that many people who saw the twins regularly didn't notice it. Richard's powers of observation had always been exceptional. It was part of what made him such a successful businessman. But seeing that attention to detail directed at my sons was disconcerting. Jordan grinned, impressed. "You're smart. Do you like dinosaurs?" "I find them fascinating," Richard replied, and to my surprise, he seemed entirely sincere, particularly the way they dominated their environment through superior adaptation. "I have a T-Rex," Jordan announced proudly. "He's the king of the dinosaurs. Wanna see?" "I would," Richard said, and allowed himself to be led to the corner of the room where the twins' toy collection was neatly organized. My influence, but exuberantly played with, Jordan's nature. Caleb remained where he was, still watching Richard with that careful assessment that sometimes made him seem much older than 4. After a moment, he stood and approached me, tugging at my hand to bring my ear down to his level. "He looks like us," he whispered, his observation sending a chill down my spine. "Does he?" I replied, trying to keep my voice casual. "I hadn't noticed." Caleb gave me a look that clearly said he didn't believe me, but he didn't press the issue. Instead, He walked over to where Richard was now kneeling beside Jordan, examining the dinosaur collection with what appeared to be genuine interest. The Triceratops was actually stronger than the T-Rex, Caleb informed Richard solemnly. It had 3 horns and a shield on its head. Richard looked up, meeting Caleb's serious gaze with equal gravity. An excellent defensive adaptation, he agreed, though the T-Rex had superior offensive capabilities. That's what I said, Jordan exclaimed, delighted to have his dinosaur preferences validated by this new adult. For the next hour, I watched in growing amazement as Richard Carter, the man who had once cut short board meetings when they interfered with his schedule, sat on my living room floor discussing the relative merits of different dinosaurs with my sons. He listened to their 4-year-old logic with the same focused attention he gave to multi-million-dollar business proposals, never talking down to them or dismissing their ideas. When Jordan asked if Richard wanted to see his drawing of a super mega ultra T-Rex with laser eyes, Richard not only agreed but offered suggestions for making the dinosaur even more formidable. And when Caleb quietly showed Richard his collection of rocks, carefully labeled in my handwriting, Richard examined each one with serious consideration, asking questions about their origins and properties that made Caleb's usually solemn face light up with enthusiasm. It was a side of Richard the first had never seen during our marriage, this patience, this willingness to engage on someone else's terms rather than imposing his own agenda. I found myself wondering if it had always been there, hidden beneath the driven businessman I had known, or if something had changed him in the 5 years since our divorce. Mr. Carter brought you both something, I said when there was a natural lull in the conversation. Would you like to see? Presents. Jordan was immediately excited, while Caleb looked cautious but interested. Richard reached for the packages he had set aside when he entered. I wasn't sure what you would like, he said, and there was an unfamiliar note of uncertainty in his voice. So I brought a few options. The first package contained books, not the generic children's stories I had expected, but carefully selected volumes that showed remarkable insight. For Jordan, a lavishly illustrated encyclopedia of dinosaurs that made him squeal with delight. For Caleb, a children's book about geology with real rock samples embedded in the cover, which he accepted with wide-eyed wonder. How did you know? I asked Richard quietly while the boys examined their books. Research, he replied simply, and observation. They're not difficult to read, Evelyn. They're quite clear about their interests. The second package contained matching stuffed dinosaurs, but with subtle differences. Jordan's was a bright green T-Rex with playful features, while Caleb's was a more realistic Triceratops in natural colors. The thoughtfulness of the gifts, tailored to each boy's distinct personality while acknowledging their twinship, was unexpected and, I had to admit, touching. Richard had spent less than an hour with them yesterday, yet he had already identified and respected their individuality in a way that many adults in their lives still struggled with. Thank you, Caleb said politely, clutching his Triceratops with careful hands. Yeah, thanks, Jordan added, already making his T-Rex stomp across the coffee table with appropriate roaring sounds. You're very welcome, Richard replied, and the genuine pleasure in his expression caught me off guard. This wasn't the calculated charm he deployed in business settings. It seemed authentic, almost vulnerable. When it was time for Richard to leave, Jordan surprised us all by throwing his arms around Richard's legs in an impulsive hug. Will you come back tomorrow? I want to show you my other dinosaurs. Richard froze for a moment, clearly unprepared for this physical display of affection. Then, slowly, he placed a hand on Jordan's dark hair in an awkward but gentle gesture. I'd like that, he said, his voice oddly rough. If it's all right with your mother. All eyes turned to me, and I found myself nodding despite my reservations. We'll be home around 4 tomorrow, I said, after the boys' swimming lesson. 4 o'clock, then, Richard confirmed, carefully extracting himself from Jordan's embrace. As he straightened, his gaze met mine over the boys' heads, and something passed between us. Not the antagonism of yesterday's confrontation, but a more complex emotion I couldn't quite name. After Richard left, the twins bombarded me with questions about my friend, most of which I deflected as gently as possible. Yes, I had known Mr. Carter for a long time. No, he hadn't visited before because he lived far away and was very busy with work. Yes, he might come back tomorrow if they were good at their swimming lesson. That night, after the boys were asleep, I sat at my kitchen table with a glass of wine, trying to process the day's events. Richard's behavior with the twins had been nothing like I expected. Where was the controlling perfectionist who had made me feel constantly inadequate during our marriage? The man who measured everything and everyone against his exacting standards and found them wanting? The Richard the First had seen today had been patient, attentive, even gentle with the boys. He had met them on their level, engaged with their interests, and shown none of the dismissiveness I had feared. It was as if the twins had accessed a version of Richard Carter that I had never known existed. My phone buzzed with a text message, interrupting my thoughts. "Thank you for today," Richard had written. "They're extraordinary children. You've done well with them." I stared at the message, reading it 3 times to be sure I hadn't misunderstood. In 5 years of marriage, I could count on one hand the number of times Richard had offered me unqualified praise. Even when I had successfully hosted elaborate dinner parties for his business associates or represented him flawlessly at charity events, his approval had always been measured, conditional, focused on how my performance reflected on him rather than on my own accomplishments. Yet here he was, acknowledging my success as a mother without qualification or agenda. It was disorienting, like discovering a room in a house you thought you knew completely. "They are extraordinary," I replied after a long moment. "And yes, I have done well with them." 3 dots appeared, indicating Richard was typing a response. They disappeared, then reappeared, suggesting he was choosing his words carefully. Finally, "I'd like to take them to the Natural History Museum this weekend. Both of them would enjoy it, I think. Would Saturday morning work?" I hesitated. A museum visit was a significant step up from an hour in our living room. More public, more extended, more like a real father-children outing. But it was also educational, controlled, and likely to appeal to both boys' interests. "I'll need to come along," I typed. "They've never been away from me with someone they've just met." The response came quickly. "Of course. I expected that. 10 a.m. Saturday. We'll be ready," I confirmed, then added impulsively, "Bring a camera. Jordan always makes the most ridiculous faces at the dinosaur exhibits." "I look forward to seeing that," Richard replied, and I could almost hear the smile in his words. I set my phone down, unsettled by the almost friendly exchange. This wasn't how I had expected my confrontation with Richard to unfold. I had prepared for legal battles, for manipulation, for the cold, ruthless businessman I had divorced to use every advantage against me. I hadn't prepared for thoughtful gifts and genuine interest in the twins' personalities and text messages about museum visits. What game was Richard playing? Was this reasonable, engaged father figure just another calculated role he was assuming to get what he wanted? Or had fatherhood, even the sudden, unexpected version thrust upon him, access something in Richard that our marriage never had? The next few weeks fell into a strange new pattern. Richard visited the twins regularly, gradually increasing from short afternoon visits to longer outings, the promised museum trip, a visit to the park, lunch at a child-friendly restaurant. Always with me present, always scrupulously respecting the boundaries we had established, always focused primarily on building relationships with Caleb and Jordan rather than asserting his authority or imposing his preferences. The boys, for their part, took to Richard with surprising ease. Jordan was immediately won over by Richard's willingness to engage in dinosaur battles and his seemingly inexhaustible knowledge of prehistoric creatures. Caleb was more reserved, as was his nature, but even he began to look forward to Richard's visits, particularly after Richard brought him a real magnifying glass and taught him how to examine his rock collection like a professional geologist. Watching them together was a surreal experience. There were moments when the physical resemblance between Richard and the twins was so striking it took my breath away. The way Caleb's brow furrowed in concentration exactly like his father's. The way Jordan's face lit up with the same rare but transformative smile that had once made me fall in love with Richard. But more disconcerting than the physical similarities were the temperamental ones I began to notice. Caleb's methodical approach to problem solving, his attention to detail, his preference for order. All traits I had attributed to his innate personality were mirrored in Richard's own methodical nature, and Jordan's boundless energy and charm, his ability to win people over with sheer force of personality, echoed the charisma that had made Richard such a successful business leader. Nature versus nurture playing out before my eyes, forcing me to acknowledge that these boys I had raised alone were undeniably their father's sons as well as mine. As the 1-month mark of our agreement approached, the deadline for introducing Richard as their father rather than just my friend, I found myself increasingly anxious about how the twins would react to this revelation. Would they feel betrayed that I had kept this information from them? Would they suddenly prefer Richard with his wealth and resources to their modest life with me? Would this new knowledge disrupt the secure, happy existence I had worked so hard to create for them? The night before our agreed-upon deadline, Richard texted me, "We need to discuss tomorrow. Can I call you after the boys are asleep?" 9:30, I replied, setting a specific time as a way of maintaining some control over the situation. At exactly 9:30, my phone rang. "Evelyn." Richard's voice was formal but not cold. "Thank you for taking my call. You wanted to discuss tomorrow?" I prompted, unwilling to engage in pleasantries when my stomach was in knots about the conversation ahead. "Yes." There was a brief pause. "I've been thinking about how best to approach this with the boys. I believe we should present a united front, with both of us explaining my identity together." "I agree," I said, somewhat surprised by his collaborative approach. "I've been preparing them in small ways, talking more about different family structures, reading them stories about children with divorced parents, that sort of thing." "Good." Another pause. "Evelyn, I want to be clear about something. I have no intention of disrupting the boys' relationship with you or undermining your authority as their mother. My goal is to add to their lives, not subtract from what you've built." The statement was so unexpected, so contrary to the controlling Richard I remembered, that for a moment I couldn't respond. "Are you still there?" he asked when my silence stretched too long. "Yes," I managed. "I'm just surprised. That's not the approach I expected from you." 5 years is a long time, Evelyn," Richard said quietly. "People can change." "So you keep saying," I replied, unable to keep the skepticism from my voice. "You don't believe me." It wasn't a question. "I believe you want a relationship with the boys," I said carefully. "I'm less certain about your long-term intentions, or whether you truly understand what being a father entails. And what does it entail, in your view?" There was no sarcasm in the question, just what seemed like genuine curiosity. I considered my answer carefully. Consistency. Putting their needs above your own. Loving them for who they are, not who you want them to be. Being present not just physically but emotionally, even when it's inconvenient or uncomfortable. All reasonable expectations, Richard acknowledged, and I intend to meet them. Parenting isn't a business objective, Richard, I said, frustration creeping into my voice. You can't just decide to excel at it and make it happen through sheer force of will. It's messy and unpredictable and often thankless. I'm aware of that, he replied, a hint of his own frustration showing. Contrary to what you seem to believe, I'm not approaching this as a corporate takeover. I'm approaching it as a man who has discovered he has 2 sons and wants to be part of their lives. The sincerity in his voice gave me pause. Was it possible that Richard truly had changed? Or was I being naive, allowing myself to be manipulated by a man who had always excelled at getting what he wanted? Tomorrow at 3, I said finally. We'll tell them together, as you suggested. But Richard, I hesitated, then continued firmly. If this goes badly, if the boys are upset or confused, we slow down. Their emotional well-being comes first. Agreed, he said without hesitation. Their well-being is my priority too, Evelyn. I hope someday you'll believe that. After we hung up, I sat for a long time staring at the phone, trying to reconcile the Richard I had known with the man who had just spoken so reasonably about co-parenting. The Richard I had married would never have accepted my conditions so readily, would never have acknowledged my expertise or deferred to my judgment about the children. Either he had truly changed in fundamental ways, or he was playing a very long, very subtle game. and I wasn't sure which possibility frightened me more. If you've ever had to completely reassess someone you thought you knew inside and out, hit that subscribe button. The journey of discovery Evelyn was on was just beginning, and the revelation about Richard's true identity to the twins would change everything, in ways none of them could have anticipated. The next day dawned bright and clear, a beautiful spring Saturday that seemed to mock my churning anxiety. I had barely slept, rehearsing different versions of the conversation ahead, imagining the twins' reactions, preparing for questions I might not be able to answer. Richard arrived precisely at 3, dressed casually again but with a tension in his shoulders that betrayed his own nervousness. This, too, was new. The Richard the First had known never showed anxiety, viewing it as a weakness to be ruthlessly suppressed. "Are you ready for this?" I asked quietly as I let him in. "As ready as I can be," he replied, his usual confidence muted. "Where are the boys?" "In the backyard. I thought we'd talk to them there. It's their favorite place, where they feel most comfortable." Richard nodded, following me through the house to the back door. Through the window, we could see Caleb and Jordan playing in the small but well-kept yard, engaged in some elaborate game involving their dinosaur figures and a makeshift landscape they had created from rocks and sticks. For a moment, we both stood watching them, these small beings who connected us in ways neither of us could have imagined 5 weeks ago. "They're happy," Richard said softly, an odd note in his voice. "You've given them a good life." "I've tried," I acknowledged, surprised by the lack of defensiveness I felt. "They deserve nothing less." "No, they don't." Richard turned to me, his expression more open than I had seen it since our early days together. "Evelyn, before we do this, I want you to know something. Whatever happens next, however the boys react, I'm grateful for what you've done for them, for raising them to be the remarkable children they are." The sincerity in his voice caught me off guard, making my throat tighten unexpectedly. "Thank you," I managed. "That means a lot." We stepped outside, calling the twins over to the small patio table where I had set out juice and cookies. A bribe, perhaps, but also a comfort for what might be a difficult conversation. "Boys," I began once they were seated, "Mr. Carter and I have something important to tell you." "Are you getting married?" Jordan asked immediately, making both Richard and me choke in surprise. "What? No," I exclaimed. "Why would you think that?" Jordan shrugged, reaching for a cookie. "Tommy at preschool said his mom's friend came over a lot, and then they got married and now he's Tommy's new dad." "Well, that's not what's happening here," I said firmly, though I couldn't help noticing the faint color that had risen in Richard's cheeks. "But it is about Mr. Carter and his relationship to our family." Caleb, always perceptive, was studying Richard's face with unusual intensity. "He looks like us," he said, repeating his observation from weeks ago. "Is that important?" Richard and I exchanged glances. Leave it to Caleb to cut straight to the heart of the matter. "Yes, that is important," I said gently. "You see, Mr. Carter isn't just my friend. He's your father." There was a moment of complete silence as both boys processed this information. Jordan's eyes widened, his cookie forgotten halfway to his mouth. Caleb's expression remained serious, thoughtful. "My father," Jordan repeated, looking from Richard to me and back again. "Like how Tommy has a father who lives in another house?" "Yes, exactly like that," I confirmed, relieved at his calm reaction. "Mr. Carter, your father, and I were married a long time ago before you were born. But we decided not to be married anymore, and he moved far away for his work." "And you didn't know about us?" Caleb asked Richard directly, his small voice serious. Richard leaned forward, meeting Caleb's gaze with equal seriousness. "No, I didn't. If I had known about you and your brother, I would have been part of your lives from the beginning. It wasn't quite the full truth, but it wasn't a lie either. If Richard had known about the pregnancy, he would indeed have been involved, though I still believed his involvement would have been controlling and possessive rather than nurturing." "So you're our dad," Jordan said, processing this new information with his usual directness. "Do we call you Dad now instead of Mr. Carter?" Richard glanced at me, clearly deferring to my judgment on this significant question. Another surprising moment of respect for my role as their mother. You can if you want to, I said carefully. Or you can keep calling him Mr. Carter until you feel comfortable with Dad. It's up to you. I think I'll call you Dad, Jordan decided immediately. Always the first to embrace new situations. I've never had a dad before, but Tommy says they're good for reaching high things and opening tight jars. A startled laugh escaped Richard, genuine amusement breaking through his careful composure. I can definitely help with high things and tight jars, he agreed, his voice warm in a way I had rarely heard during our marriage. Caleb, predictably, was more cautious. I'll still call you Mr. Carter for now, he said solemnly, until I know you better. That's perfectly fine, Richard assured him, showing none of the impatience he might once have displayed at having his authority questioned. You can call me whatever makes you comfortable, Caleb. Does this mean we'll see you more? Jordan asked, already moving past the revelation to its practical implications. I hope so, Richard said, glancing at me again. I'd like to spend more time with both of you, to really get to know you, if that's all right with your mother. All eyes turned to me again, and I felt the weight of this moment, the power I still held to shape how this relationship would develop, the responsibility to make decisions that would affect all our lives for years to come. Yes, I said finally. Your father will be spending more time with us. We're still figuring out exactly what that will look like, but he's going to be part of our family now, in a new way. Will he live with us? Caleb asked, always thinking ahead to the logical implications. No, Richard and I said simultaneously, then exchanged awkward glances. Your father has his own home, I explained, but he'll visit often, and sometimes you might visit him too. Will it be a big home? Jordan asked, his eyes lighting up with the possibilities. Tommy's dad has a swimming pool. Richard smiled, but I noticed he looked to me before answering. I do have a rather large house, he admitted. And yes, there is a swimming pool, but we'll talk about visits there later, after you've had time to get used to all this. The conversation continued for another half hour, the boys asking increasingly practical questions about what having a father meant for their daily lives. Would Richard come to their preschool graduation? Yes. Would he be at their birthday party? If invited, absolutely. Did he know how to play Dinosaur Battle Royale? He would learn. Through it all, I watched Richard with growing amazement. The man who had once cut off business associates mid-sentence was listening patiently to Jordan's rambling stories. The executive who scheduled his days in 15-minute increments was sitting calmly as Caleb methodically worked through his list of questions, each one considered with careful deliberation before moving to the next. When the boys eventually grew bored with the conversation and returned to their game, Richard and I moved to the porch steps, watching them play while maintaining a careful distance between us. That went better than I expected, I admitted quietly. They're remarkably adaptable, Richard observed, though I suspect Caleb will have more questions as he processes this. Undoubtedly, he thinks everything through layer by layer. I couldn't help the pride in my voice. Jordan dives in headfirst, but Caleb tests the water carefully before even dipping a toe. They balance each other, Richard said, a note of wonder in his voice. Even at 4, they've developed this perfect complementary dynamic. They have, I agreed, surprised by his insight. Jordan pushes Caleb to try new things, and Caleb keeps Jordan from rushing into disaster. We fell silent, watching our sons play in the afternoon sunlight. It was a strangely peaceful moment, free from the tension that had characterized most of our interactions since Richard's reappearance in my life. What happens now? I asked finally, voicing the question that had been hovering between us. Richard considered this, his expression thoughtful. Now we build something new, he said. Not what we had before, that's gone, but something that works for them and hopefully for us too. Co-parenting isn't easy, I warned, especially with your schedule and the distance between us. I'm aware, Richard acknowledged, which is why I've been meaning to tell you. I've leased an apartment in town, just temporarily, while we figure out a more permanent arrangement. I turned to stare at him, caught completely off guard. You've what? It's a short-term lease, 3 months, he explained quickly. I can work remotely most days, with trips back to headquarters as needed. It seemed the most practical solution if I'm going to be a real presence in the boys' lives. The Richard Carter I had known would never have disrupted his carefully ordered existence this way, would never have prioritized family over business. It was yet another piece of evidence that either he had changed fundamentally, or I had never really known him at all. That's a significant commitment, I said carefully. They're my sons, Evelyn, Richard replied simply. They deserve nothing less. Before I could respond, Jordan came running over, his face alight with excitement. Dad, come see the dinosaur city we built. Caleb made buildings and I made the dinosaurs that knocked them down. Richard's face transformed at being called Dad so naturally, a genuine smile breaking through his usual reserve. I'd love to see it, he said, allowing himself to be pulled toward the elaborate construction in the corner of the yard. I watched as he knelt beside the boys, listening seriously to their explanations of the dinosaur city's infrastructure and governance. Apparently T-Rexes were both the police force and the primary threat to public safety, a conflict of interest Caleb found deeply concerning. Richard asked thoughtful questions, offered suggestions that the boys actually incorporated, and seemed genuinely engaged in their imaginative world. It was impossible to reconcile this man with the cold, controlling husband I had divorced 5 years ago. That Richard would have found such play a waste of time, would have been checking his phone every few minutes for important emails, would have subtly but persistently tried to direct the activity towards something more productive. This Richard was present in a way my ex-husband had never been. Not with me, not with anyone that I had ever seen. It was as if discovering the twins had accessed something long buried within him, some capacity for connection and joy that had been suppressed beneath the driven businessman I had known. The weeks that followed brought more surprises. Richard kept his word about the apartment, establishing a comfortable but not lavish space where the boys could visit. He arranged his schedule around their routines rather than expecting us to accommodate his. He consulted me on decisions rather than imposing his will, and when we disagreed, he actually listened to my reasoning instead of dismissing it outright. Most shocking of all, he seemed to genuinely enjoy being with the twins, not as extensions of himself or heirs to his empire, but as the unique, sometimes frustrating, often delightful individuals they were. He sat through preschool performances with apparent interest, built elaborate block towers only to let Jordan gleefully destroy them, and spent hours helping Caleb categorize his ever-growing rock collection. 3 months into our new arrangement, Richard invited me to dinner, just the two of us at a quiet restaurant where we could talk without interruption. I accepted with some trepidation, unsure what agenda might be behind the invitation. I wanted to discuss the future, Richard said once we were seated, getting straight to the point as was his habit. My lease is up next week. I know, I replied, tension coiling in my stomach. This was it, the moment when he would announce he was returning to his real life, reducing his time with the boys to occasional visits, perhaps eventually losing interest altogether as the novelty wore off. I'm looking at houses in the area, he continued, surprising me yet again. Something permanent with room for the boys to grow. I'd like your input, since you know their needs better than I do. I stared at him, trying to process this unexpected development. You're moving here? Permanently? Yes. Richard met my gaze directly. I've restructured my role at Nexus. I'll still be CEO, but with a stronger executive team handling day-to-day operations. I can work remotely most of the time, with weekly trips to headquarters as needed. You're completely reorganizing your life, I said slowly. For the twins. For our family, Richard corrected quietly. Unconventional as it may be. Something in his tone made me look up sharply. Richard, what exactly are you suggesting? He hesitated, uncharacteristically uncertain. I'm not suggesting anything specific yet, just acknowledging that the four of us are connected now, permanently. We're finding our way towards some new kind of family structure, and I want to make sure it's stable and healthy for the boys. And for us? I asked, the question slipping out before I could stop it. Richard's expression softened in a way I had rarely seen during our marriage. Yes, for us too. These past months have been illuminating, Evelyn. Watching you with the boys, seeing the life you've built, the mother you've become. It's made me reevaluate many things. Such as, I prompted, my heart beating faster despite my determination to remain detached. Such as what really matters, he said simply. Such as the kind of man I want to be, not just for the twins but for myself. Such as the mistakes I made with you, and whether they're beyond repair. The directness of his statement took my breath away. During our marriage, Richard had rarely acknowledged mistakes, and never his own role in the deterioration of our relationship. That's a lot to process, I managed finally. I know, he smiled slightly, and I'm not asking for any decisions tonight. Just opening a door to possibilities I think we both thought were permanently closed. As we finished dinner, our conversation shifted to more immediate concerns. The twins' upcoming birthday, their transition to kindergarten in the fall, the swimming lessons they both loved. But beneath the practical co-parenting discussion ran an undercurrent of something new, something I hadn't allowed myself to consider until now. The possibility that Richard and I might find our way back to each other, not as the people we had been, the controlling husband and the submissive wife, but as the people we had become, the dedicated father, the confident mother, two adults who had learned hard lessons about what truly mattered. Over the following months, that possibility slowly crystallized into reality. Richard found a house not far from mine, large enough to impress the twins with its swimming pool and spacious yard, but not the ostentatious mansion I had feared. He continued to be a consistent, engaged presence in the boys' lives and gradually in mine as well. It began with small moments, lingering conversations after he dropped the twins off, shared laughter over something clever or ridiculous they had said, the occasional dinner together after they were in bed. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, we began to rediscover each other, not through the distorted lens of our failed marriage but through the clear-eyed perspective of who we had become. I saw in Richard a capacity for patience and genuine connection I had never witnessed during our marriage. He saw in me a strength and confidence that had been suppressed beneath his controlling influence. Together, we found a balance that had eluded us before, a partnership based on mutual respect rather than power and submission. The first time he kissed me again, nearly a year after reappearing in my life, it felt both familiar and entirely new, like coming home to a place that had been completely renovated in your absence. "I'm not the man you married," Richard told me that night, his usual confidence tempered with humility. "And you're not the woman I divorced. But I think perhaps these new versions of ourselves might have a chance at something better than what we had before." "What changed you?" I asked, the question that had been haunting me since he first sat on my living room floor discussing dinosaurs with our sons. Richard considered this carefully, in the thoughtful way that had become characteristic of him. "Losing you was the beginning," he admitted. "It forced me to confront parts of myself I had never examined. My need for control, my inability to connect emotionally, my tendency to view relationships as transactions. But finding the twins, and you again, that was the real catalyst. Suddenly all the success, all the power, all the wealth seemed hollow compared to what I might have had with you, with them. And now?" I asked softly. "Now I know what matters," he said simply. "And I'm asking for a second chance to get it right." 6 months later, Richard proposed, not with the grand gesture his wealth could have commanded, but with a simple question asked in our backyard while the twins built yet another dinosaur civilization nearby. This time, when I said yes, it wasn't because I was dazzled by his success or intimidated by his force of personality. It was because I had seen the man beneath the billionaire facade, the father who had learned to put his children's needs above his own, the partner who had learned to listen as well as direct. Our second wedding was nothing like our first. Where that had been a lavish society event designed to impress, this was an intimate gathering focused on family. The twins served as ring bearers, solemn Caleb taking his responsibility with characteristic seriousness, while Jordan added his own theatrical flourishes to the role. "I never thought we'd be here again," Richard murmured during our first dance, his arms holding me with a gentleness that still surprised me sometimes. "Neither did I admitted. "But then, I never thought I'd see you building dinosaur cities or attending preschool graduation ceremonies either." He laughed, the sound free and genuine in a way it rarely had been during our first marriage. Life has a way of surprising us, though I think our biggest surprises are currently plotting to steal an entire tray of cupcakes when we're not looking. I glanced over to see the twins in deep consultation near the dessert table, their dark heads bent together in what was definitely a strategic discussion. Some things never change, I said with a smile. They've been partners in crime since they could crawl. Like their mother, they're full of surprises, Richard said, his gray eyes, the same ones that looked back at me from our sons' faces, warm with an emotion that had been absent in our first marriage, genuine, unguarded love. As we moved across the dance floor, I reflected on the journey that had brought us here. From a birthday party confrontation that I had feared would destroy the life I had built, to this moment of unexpected joy and connection. The cold-hearted billionaire who had once viewed me as an accessory had become the warm, engaged father who now looked at me as an equal partner. The twins who had been my most closely guarded secret had become the bridge that connected us in ways neither of us could have imagined. Sometimes life's most painful moments, a divorce, a confrontation, a secret revealed, can lead to its greatest blessings. Sometimes the people we think we know completely can surprise us in ways that change everything. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, we get a second chance to build something better than what we lost. If you've ever believed in the power of second chances, in the possibility that people can truly change, in the hope that love can be rediscovered in unexpected ways, hit that subscribe button. I'm Mr. Harrison, and I'll be back next time with another story of love, loss, and the surprising journeys that lead us back to where we belong.